This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
That was J'ai deux amours by the American artist Josephine Baker from 1931. What did you think of it? It's kind of a soothing piece of music, isn't it? It's got a nice pace. It's in French. Whenever people are singing about France and Paris, right, it's easy to close our eyes as Americans and imagine this wonderful sort of spring day and the birds are chirping and the wine is flowing and the sun is shining. We always seem very impressed by Paris as Americans. The music itself, again, is very melodious. It's the type of song that maybe you might put on for a nice dinner party. Or maybe, as I said, you might sip some wine too late at night with a significant other. But for us on the podcast, especially after the last couple episodes when we've been talking about so much war and violence and destruction, this is kind of a nice reprieve, isn't it? You know, you can almost imagine living through all of these awful things, but now we can listen to a little Josephine Baker. Now we can relax. Now, especially as we get into the mid-1920s, life is getting a little bit better. Now, on many levels, the music that I just played for you, of course, is relaxing. It is peaceful. It does seem like a departure. But at the same time, it's still actually quite revolutionary. It's a part of this moment that we've been talking about after World War I, when Europeans discarded the old traditional authorities in search of something that was radically new, something that was experimental, something that was different. And as I said, of course, we've talked about this largely in terms of politics so far, including both communism. We talked about the rise of new nation states or the return of new nation states in the early 1920s. But not all revolutions are political, nor do they have to be necessarily physically violent. It's possible to kind of carry out an intellectual violence, if you will, to disrupt, to use a term that people in the 2000s and early 2010s love, right? The idea of disruptors. We love disrupting. But this disruption isn't just destructive, it's also creative. It's birthing something new. And this is really the moment of the 1920s that we want to explore today. Now, for those of you who aren't more familiar with Josephine Baker, she is perhaps one of the most incredible stories of the 20th century. She was an African-American woman born in the slums of St. Louis in 1906. She was already married, divorced, and remarried by the age of 15. and she came to Paris in 1925 as part of an all-black dance review. Just 19 years old at the time, she took the city of Paris by storm and became a huge star who by the late 1920s could pull in a salary as high as $5,000 a month. $5,000 a month. That is a lot of money, even today, right? In the United States today, 2023, that's a lot of money. But to put that in perspective, for someone in the late 1920s, that is about 10 times the average taxpayer. Now, certainly some of this is that Baker can sing, she can dance, but a huge part of her appeal was the way she broke through Victorian reluctance to display the female body. Even from her first act, she was scantily clad, wearing only a pink flamingo feather over her private areas, right? So she actually comes in, there's a guy who kind of like carries her in on stage, almost like she's some sort of captive, and all she's wearing is a pink flamingo feather. Even today, that might be pretty scandalous depending on where you saw that. Now later, she would transform this into a specific act called the danse sauvage, or the wild dance, which featured hip shaking. She only wore a skirt made of bananas for this. But again, it became enormously popular, in part because it was so revolutionary. By 1927, she was the toast of the town, hanging out with people like Pablo Picasso, Ernest Hemingway, and Jean Cocteau. And in 1927, Josephine Baker actually became the first African American to star in a motion picture. It was called La Sirène des Tropiques, or the Siren of the Tropics. And it, as you might imagine, the plot was a little fanciful. It's about this woman. She's kind of chasing after a lover. She wants to kind of bring him back. And basically she gets sidetracked. And she winds up being stuck in Europe. And she's got time on her hands. So she's teaching people how to do the Charleston, other dances. If you've ever seen any of the Elvis movies from the early 60s, right, where the whole point of the movie is not the plot, it's just for Elvis to sing and dance a little bit, this is kind of what Sirène des Tropiques is like in 1927. Now, there's a lot more one could go into about Baker. She worked for the French Resistance during World War II. She became a leader in the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s. In fact, she is the only invited or planned female speaker during the 1963 March on Washington. In fact, Josephine Baker is so heralded, so well known, such a big star in France that just recently she was interred in the Pantheon in Paris. The Pantheon is like a temple to heroes of the French nation. It's where all the big names, except for maybe Napoleon, maybe some of the royalty, are buried in France today, right? It is a huge deal for her to be given such an honor. But again, to go back to just how revolutionary she was in the 1920s, consider how many boundaries this woman had to break through, how many glass ceilings she had to shatter in order to become Josephine Baker. She achieved social mobility in a world that was still largely constrained by social class, coming from virtually nothing to become wealthy and famous. She became a popular black woman in a European society that was not only almost entirely white, but which was also obsessed with ideas of race and racial hygiene and policing racial boundaries. Baker was publicly sexual in an era where, for many people, the idea of showing your ankle was often considered too provocative. And finally, and in some ways perhaps most importantly, she was one of the first Americans to become culturally influential in Europe, where American culture had often been thought of as kind of inferior, as mechanical, as cheap. To be an American in pre-World War I Europe is often to be looked down upon, kind of like your country bumpkin, somebody from the backwaters, somebody who's from the boonies, right? You don't have real culture as an American. Josephine Baker is part of the beginning of that story shifting to where people begin to look at American culture and say, wow, if it's American, it must be pretty good. In all these ways, then, Josephine Baker was quite the pathbreaker, a harbinger of a new modern European spirit that celebrated experimentation, the breaking of barriers, and the emancipation of the human spirit. And these are all topics that we want to explore in our next few episodes on modernism and the 1920s. Now, for many of you, this is going to be a really exciting lecture, right? This is a lecture that we've moved past all the death and destruction and the politics, and now we're going to talk about boundary breaking. And we live in an era when we tend to lionize boundary breaking. Certainly, if you identify as progressive, if you identify probably as liberal, many people look around us at the world today and we say, all of these barriers that exist, we're either recognizing them or we're breaking them or we're changing them, right? We're starting to unravel structural issues going on. We can also look at this again as a moment of freedom, right? We prize individual freedom and achievement. And we've once again become kind of suspicious of traditional authorities and structures. You know, the idea that, well, just because people did this for 60 years, 100 years, just because this is the traditional way of approaching things, basically in all elements of our culture, there is a broad movement to celebrate the idea of breaking those traditions. Now, it's not only a 21st century ideology or impulse to do this. You guys are probably familiar with a man named Thomas Jefferson, right? Was also famous a little bit for breaking some rules, breaking some structures. As Jefferson once wrote, a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. But boundaries, rules, customs, these things often exist for good or positive reasons. But boundaries, rules, customs, social norms, these things don't just exist as means of repression or, structures of inequality or things like that. They often exist for good or positive reasons. They help provide us with order. They give us expectations about what we should do and what we shouldn't do, right? What is the proper form of behavior? When my students come in to sit down for class, what are expectations about the clothes they're wearing, the activities that they're doing in the classroom, the language that they're using? What if two people go on a date, right? Don't we want expectations about, who's doing what and when and what's appropriate and what's inappropriate? What about a business transaction, right? So life is full of a lot of rules. And these rules and traditions, as I've said, they're not just there to repress us. They have a functional role in human society. So what happens when we start breaking these boundaries? As we saw in our previous two episodes, sometimes when we break boundaries, there are violent and destructive consequences. And this is something that people living in European society specifically, but human society more generally, this idea of being a little bit conscious of, well, what happens if we don't enforce the rules? There have been questions about that. There have been anxieties about it, right? The idea that what happens if we transcend those limits that society has established? You can go back to the ancient Greeks and start reading stories about people like Icarus and Daedalus, right? Icarus, famously, right? They learn how to fly. They put the wax with the feathers on. Awesome. Icarus flies too close to the sun and dies as a result. What about a story like Frankenstein? We talked about Frankenstein already in our episode on Romanticism, right? What happens if we start experimenting with the human body? What happens if we start, pushing science past the boundaries or the limits? What happens if we start cloning ourselves? Are we going to get something like Multiplicity, which is a Michael Keaton movie from the 1990s? It's a comedy. It's funny. Haha. Are we going to get something like The Last of Us or something like any other AI movie or zombie movie where, we basically create something that then comes back and destroys us? This isn't something that people have just started thinking about in the 21st century. It goes back all the way to antiquity. In the 1920s, therefore, as people like Josephine Baker get up on the stage and say, you know what, I, as a woman, don't have to hide my sexuality. I don't have to hide my body. I don't have to hide the fact that I'm African American or that I'm American. as these people begin to break boundaries, it's easy to understand why so many of these developments cause massive amounts of anxiety among inhabitants of 1920s Europe. So the broader point that I'm trying to make here is that fear and freedom are in many ways two sides of the same coin, produced in the lab of modernity in Europe during the 1920s. And this is what we're going to get into today in our episode on Modernism's lab, Making New Worlds. Okay, when we last left off, we had discussed the Wilsonian moment. We talked about Europeans' attempt to reconstruct the continent after the disaster of the Great War. And we saw how for many Europeans, even these Wilsonian promises of freedom and equality, even those promises, even if they breathe kind of temporary life into the Entente cause in 1918, even if they provide a brief moment of meaning for the war, by the end of the 1920s, for a lot of people, these things seem to break down, right? The promises don't bear fruit. They don't come to fruition. Instead, what we get is a lot more violence. For millions of Europeans, then, the lesson of World War I is simply that the 19th century European society, with its emphasis on liberalism, on rationality, positivism, capitalism, all of these things are completely corrupt and degenerate. They have led us to catastrophe, and what we need is radical change. But again, as I mentioned in the intro to the podcast, not all revolutions have to be physically violent. Indeed, for many of these Europeans who are shocked and horrified at the war, the violence is precisely the problem. So how do you organize a revolution if you're a pacifist? The answer for many people living in the 1920s, somewhat interestingly, is very similar to what happens in the 1960s. Right? The 1960s, there is plenty of violence. There are revolutions. But the biggest revolution in the 1960s, the one that kind of proves to be durable, the one that really creates dramatic change, is the Cultural Revolution. And so basically, this also occurs, one could argue, in the 1920s. There is a massive cultural revolution that takes place that attacks some of the very philosophical and cultural foundations of European society. Now, as we saw in our episode on the fin de siècle movement, some of the artistic revolutions that we're going to talk about today, they start or begin, or they have their origins, if you will, in pre-World War I Europe. Right? We're going to talk a little bit about painting styles. We're going to talk a little bit about architecture. We'll talk later about technology. Many of these things actually start in the 1880s and 1890s. So from a conceptual standpoint, much of the foundational work of these revolutions has already been done pre-World War I. But what happens after the Great War is that these little kind of fires, if you will, these little sparks that have happened in various urban sites in Europe, they explode, right? It's almost like World War I releases a bunch of gas or a bunch of oil into the air or something like that. And this is going to fuel this explosion of cultural revolution that we're going to talk about today. So let's get into some of the details here. Let's imagine for a moment that you are one of these people. You're a writer, an artist, you're a pacifist. You look at the hallmarks of 19th century bourgeois society. You look at this emphasis on something like reason, this idea of progress, which now seems very kind of grotesque in the wake of the war. You look at capitalism, and you think, wow, this is just exploiting people. This hasn't made life better. It's actually made it worse. So you look at these things and you feel nothing but contempt. How is it then that you could express your rejection of them without resorting to physical violence? Already by 1915, artists from across Europe began to answer these questions through the foundation of something called the Dada movement. Now, it was led by men like the Romanian poet Tristan Tzara and the Frenchman André Breton. But basically, what they sought to do was to highlight the absurdity of life by reveling in the destruction of reason, meaning, and logic. So instead of saying, here's my argument, here's my position, kind of having this debate as, an Enlightenment thinker would have said was natural, was the way to go. What they want to do is celebrate anarchy and chaos. They want to celebrate the destruction or the negation of the values of 19th century bourgeois society. Even the name of the movement, Dada, is supposed to kind of reflect this idea of revolution through negation. Right? If I say Impressionism, if I say Cubism, if I say Neoclassicism, if you don't know what those things actually mean, there's an element in the title or in the name that kind of describes a little bit what it is, right? So Neoclassicism, what is it? Well, it's going to be somewhat new, but it is using elements of classical art, right? So Neoclassicism makes total sense. What does Dada mean? If I say Dada, what's the first thing you probably think of is some baby, right? Just going da, 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 da. Right? It's just sounds. It's gibberish. It's what we say before we know words, before we know language. And so Dada itself doesn't really carry an exact meaning. Even this notion of a baby talking, they don't necessarily, members of the Dada movement wouldn't necessarily agree with that. So the whole idea is about refusing to comply with traditional expectations. Another example of how Dada reflects the revolutionary trends that we're kind of illuminating today was its further assault on the idea of language. Now, I know, again, we live in this era of structures. People are talking about structural racism, structural inequalities, structure. It's very similar to the 1960s in that regard. Is not one of the most structured institutions in human society language itself? Is language not full of rules and regulations and conventions and someone telling you this is the format by which you must communicate? If you communicate in a different format, if you use different words, if your syntax is off, if your grammar is wrong, you will be judged because you are not conforming to the rules that have already been written that you had no say in. So what would happen if we decided to attack the logical consistency one expects in something like language? This is essentially one of the main goals of the Dada movement. To give you a specific example of what I'm talking about, let's take Tristan Tzara, who I mentioned. In 1920, Tzara, who had come to live in Paris by this point, comes up with this really kind of interesting idea. He says, let's just cut up newspapers and we'll take random words out of the newspaper and we'll just put them into some order. And this will be a poem. There's no syntax. There's no meaning necessarily associated with it. We just kind of jumble them together and see what happens. Some of you, of course, might have done this when you were kids, or maybe your parents did. You have like magnets and they have words on them and you just kind of put them in a funny order on the refrigerator. That's something that Tzara is basically doing in 1920. Another example of his kind of Dada spirit, he decides, okay, one night I'm going to get up, I'm going to read a speech by a famous intellectual. I'm going to read this speech from the stage. And the whole time I'm doing it, I'm going to have members of the audience with bells and whistles, and they're basically going to try to drown out what I'm saying. And so the art isn't the idea of, okay, I'm reading this speech. The art is the idea of disrupting the speech. The idea that society doesn't have to listen to you, intellectual people, doesn't have to listen to you, elites, doesn't have to listen to you, learned scholars with all your rationality, right? We can just drown you out. As you can imagine, Tzara probably would have loved something like Twitter or Facebook in the modern era. Another tactic Dada artists pursue was invented by Breton, which he initially called the idea of auto-writing. This was, he described it as, the dictation of thought, free of any influence exercised by reason, heedless of all moral and aesthetic concerns. In other words, just write down everything that comes into your head. Don't try to put it into any order. Don't try to censor it. Just let the stream of consciousness flow out into nature, into the world. And that's the most organic, least rational, most free and liberated way of approaching things. Now, I do have to say, I think the idea of, what if we just went around and literally said whatever we thought, maybe that's a little bit of a scary proposition. Right? Maybe there's things that we really don't want to hear people say or think. Or maybe we would get upset about some of the things that they're thinking because they're not listening to us. Right? As you can imagine, as a professor, if I was sitting in a classroom and I just listened to everything the students were actually thinking as I was lecturing, that would be a pretty good way to drive yourself crazy. Another thing that the Dada artists like to do is they take the abstraction found in Cubism even further. They perform their rejection of cultural norms by creating irreverent, nonsensical works that defied conventional understanding. To put this another way, you take something that is sacred, that is loaded up with meaning, that people instantly recognize, and you draw a mustache on it. Right? Literally, this is what happens. There's a French artist named Marcel Duchamp, and he takes Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, not the original, of course, but he makes a copy of the Mona Lisa, and he draws a mustache on it, and then he titles it with the graffiti expression for "She has hot pants." 2 years later, Duchamp probably outdoes himself. He actually takes a urinal, and he says, "This urinal is now a sculpture, and I'm going to call it the Fountain." So again, trying to be as absurd as possible, trying to say, here's these things associated with daily life, associated with your life, that you either think of as sacred or that you think of as private, and I'm going to just kind of blow up your whole structure of meaning, your whole landscape of where things go and why and what's appropriate. Now, as you might imagine, these Dada guys tend to be a little extreme, right? They're a little bit kind of hardcore, and it probably wouldn't surprise you to learn that a lot of other artists who are involved in the project initially begin at some point to have a break with Dada. It's too extreme. We can't live in a world with no meaning, right? So we have to create some meaning. But Dada inspires a sort of secondary movement that becomes very popular and very influential, which also continues this kind of attack on 19th century bourgeois values, especially the ideas of, again, reason and positivism. Now, perhaps the most famous of these splinter movements was begun by Breton in 1924, and it became known as Surrealism, an artistic style that tried to emphasize the illogical or contradictory impulses of the human mind. Put another way, the Surrealists want to blur the divisions between reality and dreams. Now, this type of art is often characterized by kind of odd images, non sequiturs, or other absurdities that are designed to kind of shock us, to kind of waken us, to try to make us go, wait, what? What am I looking at? Perhaps the best known example of surrealism can be found in the work of the Catalan painter Salvador Dali, who moved into surrealism in the late 1920s. He is, of course, the author of one of the most famous surrealist paintings. I will put a copy of it up on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com, but my guess is that you may have seen it elsewhere before. It's known as The Persistence of Memory, and he painted it in 1931. Now, the painting depicts a series of melting clocks against a kind of beachy, mountainous-type landscape, thereby reflecting some of the primary surrealist values. This notion of, again, the blurring of boundaries, right? If you think about something like time, time in an Enlightenment sense is something that is quantifiable, right? We have invented clocks, we have invented calculators, go back to sundials and things like that. Humans have spent many, many years, many, many centuries trying to figure out how do we measure the flow of time. And of course, today we have minutes, we have seconds, we have nanoseconds, right? Especially with some of the mathematical calculations that we have to make, measuring down to the very, very smallest, most liminal moment of time is something that we do quite precisely. But is time something that exists in a solid state? Can you really ever actually stop time in order to quantify it exactly? If I tell you the clock on my computer just switched to 11:01 a.m., I've told you that, but by the time the sound hits the computer, goes through the microphone, gets into the recording, it's no longer 11:01 a.m., it is 11:01 a.m. ... Right? Some mathematical number. Time, one could argue, is a liquid. Time is something that flows. Time is something in a state of constant motion. And so for this reason, Dali makes the clocks themselves melt, right? It is literally the idea that time is melting, time is flowing, time is not something that we can really fully grasp or totally get our hands on in a kind of Enlightenment, rationalist type of way. Now, there's a second element that makes this painting particularly amazing, particularly exemplary for an example of surrealism. And that is its title, right? The idea of memory. Memory also kind of inhabits this world in between. Your memories that you have in your mind are not literally the past. They are memories, they are acts of remembrance, a verb, that you are conducting in the present to recall something that happened in the past. So it's not the present because you're thinking about the past, but it's not directly the past because it's interfered with, it's created in the present, it's affected by the present. Your memories of things that happened long ago are definitely affected by, what's going on in your life right now. By society as well. What society has decided is appropriate to remember and how to remember. So memory exists as well in this kind of liminal space, the in-between, the irrational, and surrealists wanted to celebrate that. Now, before we move on from painting, there is one additional painter that we should definitely discuss, very popular in this period. Sometimes he gets labeled as being a surrealist, although quite a few scholars would argue that he's not really a surrealist. There's some similarities, but he's not quite there. And this is, of course, the Russian Jewish painter Marc Chagall. Chagall basically comes of age right before World War I. He moves around a lot. He's in St. Petersburg. He's in Berlin. He's in Paris. He actually goes home to Russia, where he is kind of trapped during World War I. So he does a lot of painting over the course of World War I. He ends up setting up a school, ends up working actually with the Bolsheviks in the very early stages of the Russian Revolution. And then in 1923, he returns to Paris, which Paris and Berlin are kind of the two major centers, if you will, of a lot of the artistic revolution that we're getting into today. Now, despite these wanderings, Chagall never really loses interest in his roots, which come from basically a Jewish village, a rural upbringing. And so these Jewish and Russian themes are often highlighted in his works. But his representations are not meant to be accurate in the sense of reproducing reality, right? He's not trying to document in a sort of photographic way what life was like on the village. Instead, he wants to kind of reflect the nostalgia or the emotional attachment that one has, the feeling of longing, the feeling of homesickness, again, the feeling of nostalgia that you have for your place of birth. And so many of his paintings, you can kind of tell what they look like, but they also are kind of cubist as well, right? Things are not reproduced in kind of one-to-one, exact relationships, but instead they're a little bit distorted, but just enough, but you can still figure out what they are. So one of Chagall's most famous paintings, for example, was made in 1912, right before the war, and it was known as The Fiddler. It featured a kind of lightly abstracted fiddler with a green face and a blue beard, surrounded by floating buildings from the village. So again, Chagall, trying to explore this idea of nostalgia, trying to paint emotion and psychology as opposed to painting what is. This is a core idea of this kind of post-World War I artistic movement, this idea of, again, creating these new artistic approaches. Now, whether all of these approaches were technically surrealist or not, this sense of distortion was explored by a whole host of interwar painters who were fascinated by the destruction wrought by the Great War. And here one can talk about the paintings of people like the German Max Ernst, or the Briton Paul Nash. And these were typical for the period, right? All these World War I veterans, they come home. How do they deal with the trauma of the war? Quite a few of them actually take up painting. And they start painting the trenches, they start painting the destroyed landscapes, and they try to reflect not what it actually looked like, but they try to reflect the psychology of processing that, looking out at a battlefield and seeing apocalypse. Okay, enough about painting. Let's talk about something like writing. While artists like Picasso and Dali were basically taking a sledgehammer to visual styles of art, the writer James Joyce and his fellow expressionists basically did the same for literary conventions. Now, to get an idea of how radical their rebellion was, again, think about kind of what is the tradition that they're going to be rebelling against. If you are a writer, if you go to Writing 101, what are the most basic things that they're going to tell you need in any story? Well, obviously we need characters, and we want to develop those characters. We want to have some kind of plot. Those characters need to go through various challenges. They will either overcome those challenges in this kind of celebratory, heroic type of novel. Maybe they won't. Maybe it's a tragedy. Maybe Romeo and Juliet, they can never get past the hatred of their two families, and so they both die, and everybody's sad. But we need a plot. We need characters. How are we going to advance that plot? Well, before 1920, we advance it through dialogue. Either we have a kind of basic description of this is what happens, or if you think about any of your kind of major literary works, think about something like Lord of the Rings, right? Quite a complicated plot in that. How does Tolkien advance the narrative? Well, we have descriptions of things, and then from time to time, the character says something to someone else. So this is how kind of basically books move along. If we have a play, we have the characters, they interact. Dialogue is key, is the point that I'm trying to make. But what if we want to show contempt for, again, the institutional approach to writing? What if we want to blow up all this stuff about plot and characters? Instead of advancing or revealing plot through dialogue and description, could we instead step inside the mind of one of the characters to get closer to their emotional states of being, to their emotionally influenced perceptions of the worlds that they inhabit? This is essentially what modernist writers of the early 1920s do. They say, let's get away from looking at the plot of a book, looking at the interaction of characters in a book as if we were just an observer, as if we were an outsider just kind of watching them talk to each other. Let us get inside the heads of the characters within the novel. And so this is basically what is pioneered by the Irish writer James Joyce. Born in 1882, Joyce was an Irishman from Dublin who turned to writing and English teaching as a young man immediately before the outbreak of World War I. Now, during the war, Joyce spends most of his time in Zurich, where a whole bunch of other anti-war artists and intellectuals were congregating, including, as it just so happens, one Vladimir Lenin. I've mentioned a couple times now that there are these kind of parallels between the political revolutionaries and the artistic revolutionaries. And sometimes those parallels, sometimes those connections are not just kind of abstract, but they may have taken place in the real world. It is entirely possible that James Joyce sat down and had a coffee next to or with Vladimir Lenin at some point. Now, they never talk about it. There's no evidence that that ever happened, but it could have. It's one of these kind of interesting moments in history, these connections of people who, again, are all kind of about overthrowing existing society in all different types of ways. At any rate, while he is in Zurich, Joyce publishes a very important work called A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, but he spends most of his time working on what will become his masterpiece, Ulysses. Now, Ulysses was published in serial form in the beginning, so they publish a couple chapters in newspapers at regular intervals. Later on, it will be published in its complete form in 1922. But Ulysses is a radical attempt to deconstruct the traditional narrative by smashing through the false images that pervaded society. In other words, Joyce's revolution is going to be to tell the story as it really is, as opposed to the sanitized version of events that we usually get in books and novels and things like that. The story, to the extent that it exists, loosely recreates the idea of Homer's Odyssey by following its protagonist Leopold Bloom through the streets of Dublin on an ordinary day. So there isn't a big plot in the classic sense for this book, right? It's basically going to be about wanderings. That is in some ways what the Odyssey is. The Odyssey is the story of Ulysses post-Trojan War, wandering around the Greek islands trying to kind of make his way home. Now, one of the most important revolutionary aspects of Ulysses was the way that it approached, again, the concept of storytelling. Instead of using dialogue to move the plot along like most books do, it introduced the idea of stream of consciousness. It attacked the idea of grammatical convention. The writing dispensed with the ideas of following what the characters said. And again, as I mentioned, it kind of tries to get into their minds and talk about what are they thinking about, regardless of how rational or how socially acceptable those thoughts were. Think about it. Think about your day. Think about the thoughts that drift through your head on an ordinary, average day. Of course, all of us think about, what is it that I have to do today? What am I going to eat today? What are the things that I want to do today? Am I going to play a game? Am I going to go outside? Am I going to smoke a cigarette? Think about it for a second. If we tried to tell the history of your life, one day in your life, what would that look like? Besides all the traditional questions, besides all the things, again, if this was writing 101 and I told my students, tell the story of your day, right? Okay, so they would say, well, I got up, I did this, I did that, blah, blah, blah. I thought these things. But what's the real story behind that? What are the things that you think about maybe that are somewhat taboo, that you're not supposed to think about, that you're not supposed to talk about, but you do it anyways, sometimes just instinctually because, we're human beings. We have an irrational side, an instinctive side that's in us. What about the things that are just not socially polite to talk about? I mean, there's the kind of boring stuff, like if I said write the history of a day in your life, do you really go into detail about what you had for breakfast, when you put your clothes on, the kind of mundane stuff? But there's also the stuff that, again, is kind of taboo or uncomfortable that you wouldn't include, right? You wouldn't write a history of yourself and say, well, then at this point I went to the bathroom. At this point I wiped my butt, right? This is not stuff that we would say would be appropriate. You would never write a history of something. Let's write a history of the 1986 New York Mets. And we're going to talk about when people were going to the bathroom? No. We may talk about steroids and drug usage, but that's a different story. This is essentially what James Joyce brings to the table with Ulysses. There are essentially no taboos or filters in his book, which contain graphic discussions of things like bathing, eating, defecating, menstruation, and sexuality as well. In one of the most famous scenes in the book, for example, which incidentally gets it banned in the United States for some time, Bloom, the leading character, masturbates in public while watching a woman who is provocatively showing him her legs and undergarments from afar, basically with the idea of she's trying to entice him or arouse him, which again is not something that women in early 20th century society were supposed to do. Women in early 20th century society are supposed to kind of be asexual, or supposed to kind of hide all that as to not arouse men, as to not kind of make them emotional. Now, making this matter even kind of more taboo, even more kind of gross, Bloom, his wife, is having an affair, literally having the affair, as he is out on the stroll, sitting on the bench, watching this woman do this thing. So again, the censors weren't too happy about that, but the idea was to shock. The idea was to bring the reality of life into literature. Finally, as if all this wasn't enough, Joyce also assaulted kind of convention by filling his book with parodies, alliterations, puns, and other playful literary devices that highlights its irreverence. In the long run, the book was highly successful and influential, becoming one of the most important publications of the 20th century, certainly one of the most outstanding examples of the modernist spirit that dominated the 1920s. Finally, there's one last field of innovation where post-war artists carried out their major revolution, and that is the field of architecture. Now, if any of you have ever been to the urban center of a major European city, you've no doubt seen much of the traditional forms of architecture that predated modernism. There are some exceptions to this, maybe some cities like Frankfurt, certain parts of Paris perhaps, but for the most part, when you go to a major European city, the buildings are either built before 1900 or they are recreations of buildings built before 1900. And those buildings most likely resemble a kind of Roman architecture. Right? We tend to see stone or brick structures. We see a kind of rectangular building with triangles or domes on top. You might see a column. You might see archways. Most of the windows, of course, are going to be square windows. And so while obviously there's a lot of evolution, a lot of ebb and flow stylistically in terms of European architecture, the bookends of these periods, the Renaissance, the Gothic era of the 1830s and 40s, these tend to have similar shapes, just with more decorative elements added to them. The middle part of this period, again, architecture from about, let's say, 1500, running all the way through to 1900, the middle of this period tends to be the neoclassical period. Right, so we're going to strip away some of these kind of fancy things, strip away some of the niceties. But basically, in all of these buildings, the space is very similar. It is importantly rationalized. If you think about the structures that I've just described, if you think about the geometric shapes, are not squares and archways the strongest pre-industrial geometric shapes? If I'm going to build a building, does it not make sense that I am going to make it square? Does it not make sense that I'm going to at least try to make the various floors all be level? That I want a roof that will be triangular so that when all the snow falls, it doesn't just sit on my roof, but it falls down, slides down, the rain, etc. So architecture pre-1900 is incredibly rationalized. But by the beginning of the 20th century, the new modernist movement began to reject some of these conventions. Modernism, after all, rejected the Enlightenment notion of certainty and rationality. And instead, they wanted to get again at this idea of the psychological, the irrational, and the self-conscious. Now, again, as I mentioned at the start of this podcast, many of these kind of trends that we're talking about today, you can date their emergence or their initial kind of creation to the period before World War I. And so if we're talking about sort of revolutions, the development of modern architecture, the number one name to go to is someone that we've already talked about, which is Antonio Gaudi. Right? We're going to go back and look at how Gaudi began to say, I don't want straight lines in my buildings. I want to make it more of a living thing, an organic thing. But it is in the 1920s that this modernist spirit in architecture absolutely explodes, especially in the Weimar Republic in Germany. Now, there are many, many architects and buildings that we could talk about here, but one of the most influential architects was a German Jew named Erich Mendelsohn. Born in 1887 in East Prussia, he had spent time in Berlin and Munich, where he developed connections with expressionist groups such as Der Blaue Reiter and Die Brücke. So basically, these are, again, kind of modernist or pre-modernist painting circles, artist circles, and the idea that you're an architect, right, someone who's supposed to be sort of an engineer, someone who's supposed to be well-versed in science, and you're hanging out with all these artists, that's kind of interesting, right? And it's not accidental then that someone like Mendelssohn would say, I want to change the way that architecture is done because he's being influenced by these kind of artistic thinkers. Incidentally, he is a very scientific guy. He also hangs out with astrophysicists. This is Berlin in the 1920s, right? You can do all of this. At the heart of Mendelssohn's architecture was the philosophy that art should match the spirit of the age. Modern architecture in the industrial age, therefore, needed to dump the old-fashioned stone facades and more openly embrace the two quintessentially modern materials used in construction. Can you think of what they might be? We're talking here, of course, about glass and steel. Glass and steel are the materials that enable us to build skyscrapers. And we'll get into a discussion of skyscrapers later on in a different episode. But basically, again, Mendelsohn is saying architecture post-1920 needs to be about glass and steel. Now, he also says that architecture needs to resolve the tensions of the age. And one of the big tensions of the age is the problem of living in crowded, urban, and increasingly mechanized environments. Human beings may be rational, but we also have a kind of romantic side to us. We also love nature. We need nature. We don't want to just live in a concrete jungle. Even if you go to a big city where there is literally a concrete jungle, we want plants. We want nature. We want windows. We want sunlight. And so therefore, Mendelsohn tries to blend his buildings into nature or into its immediate surroundings. Now, one of the first prominent examples of Mendelssohn's architecture was the building of the Einstein Tower in Potsdam, which is located just outside of Berlin. Basically, the observatory was built in order to test Einstein's theory of relativity, which, if you remember in our lecture on modernism, Einstein was a very big figure in this kind of emergence of modernism and this kind of lack of certainty that we've been talking about. If you happen to look at a picture of the Einstein Tower, you probably wouldn't guess that it is an observatory. You might think that it's just kind of this large concrete boot, because that's what it looks like. Instead of having the rationalized straight lines, it's mostly curves. Even the windows, in fact, are curved. But not just circles, because circles aren't really that different, right? A circle at its heart is a rationalized geometric shape. We have a constant radius. But these are kind of hybrids between circles and squares. So they look really kind of interesting if you look at it. The Einstein Tower is also shaped to fit into its surrounding area. The interior has a lot of light because of all these kind of funky windows. It looks very organic, one might say, which is, again, not accidental, right? He's trying to blend it into the idea of nature. Now, the building itself was supposed to be made of concrete because concrete is, if you will, the third kind of major building material of the modern world. They didn't have a lot of concrete in Germany in 1919 because it was right after the end of the war. And so they actually used kind of like a stucco material to put the outside together. Another great example of Mendelssohn's architecture, if you find this stuff very interesting as I do, you could look at the Schocken department store in the German city of Chemnitz, whose exteriors featured large curved glass windows. If you look at the department store in Chemnitz, your initial reaction would be, this building was built in the 1950s or 60s. There is no way that it was built in the 1920s or 30s. However, that's the kind of style, right? This is almost futuristic, curved glass steel. Now, another German architect that we should mention is a guy named Walter Gropius, who happened to be briefly married to the composer Gustav Mahler's widow. So again, we're seeing this kind of fusion of artistic and scientific or engineering-related kind of influences here. You know, one could argue, if I go off on a little side note here, a lot of people today say, well, the liberal arts are a bunch of crap. It's useless. Why take an art history class? What could you possibly learn from that? Why take a history class? What we're seeing here is art and science working together to create new, to inspire new. The two actually go, I would argue, quite nicely together. They inform and infuse each other with new meaning. So those of you that are college students, don't be afraid to take classes outside of your home department. Don't be afraid to step into other disciplines. It might just inspire you to amazing things. At any rate, getting back to Gropius, he was a war veteran. He won 2 Iron Crosses during World War I for bravery. But again, he kind of walks away from the war and says, I am not comfortable with the world as it is. I want revolution. Not necessarily political revolution, but he wants revolution in art. And when I say revolution, I don't just mean this kind of metaphorically. Let me read you a quote by Walter Gropius that I think really brings home the kind of the passion, the fire, if you will, the destructiveness that is inherent in his kind of approach to architecture. Today's artist, he wrote, lives in an era of dissolution, without guidance. He stands alone. The old forms are in ruins. The benumbed world is shaken up. The old human spirit is invalidated and in flux towards a new form. We float in space and cannot yet perceive the new order. End quote. So to help create this new order, Gropius recommended a new style of architecture that would break down barriers between the various forms of art, barriers between teachers and students, between machine and man, and between labor and art. The new architecture, he said, should contain no, quote, trickery, end quote, revealing a building's function rather than trying to conceal it by its style. Think about how many buildings you pass. Think about when you're driving to work, or if you are a college student, if you're going by campus. Think about all the buildings you pass. Do you know what goes on inside of the buildings? Is it immediately clear what the purpose is or what's being done inside the buildings? Gropius says you should have an idea. We should open this up. We should allow buildings to express the point of what's going on inside of them. Finally, Gropius not only celebrated new construction materials such as steel and glass, but also embraced the path-breaking idea of prefabrication. Now, most of us, if I say prefabrication today, you tend to think of that as a negative, right? A prefab house must be cheap. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe we need some temporary housing, or maybe you're a young person, or maybe you're operating on a limited budget. Prefab doesn't sound so bad. But in this era, prefabrication is futuristic. It's space age type stuff. We're going to mass produce all of these houses and apartments, and we're going to change the way that the world works. And prefabrication is going to play a huge part in that process. Now, to help carry through this revolution, Gropius founded a new school known as the Bauhaus, which would combine various types of art in order to create a, quote, comprehensive form of artwork. One can see the ways in which Gropius tried to put some of these ideas into practice with the Bauhaus building in Dessau, which was completed in 1925. Now again, as I said, when most of us go and walk around a campus, you see a bunch of buildings, but you don't really know what's going on inside of them. There's not really a clear sense of, well, this is humanities, this is science, right? Because it's all kind of similar and the functions are kind of hidden. The Dessau campus's main building is basically built where instead of just having a window to the outside, the entire exterior wall is made of glass and steel. And the idea here is that you want the students to see what the other students are doing. You want to break down those barriers between the different arts, for example, right? So this is an artistic campus. You have some people that are doing decorative arts, some people that are working with other types of arts. Basically, you want them all interacting with each other. Now, there's a number of other big names, as I said, in the history of architecture that could fit into this period. If you're American, you've probably heard the name Frank Lloyd Wright before. Lloyd Wright was already an architect before World War I, so he had already kind of reached a period of maturity. He was working on some very interesting and innovative styles. But in the post-war era, he becomes more radical, becoming more and more part of this revolution, as opposed to kind of just part of what existed before. Another architect that we'll talk about in more detail in our episode on modernity in the city is the French-Swiss architect Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, better known as Le Corbusier. For now, however, it's simply enough to note that in the post-war period, Europeans not only carried out revolutions in art, but also started to reimagine the physical space that surrounded them as well. Having said that, it's worth noting that it wasn't just the physical space that one could reimagine, because the 1920s was also the decade when film first burst onto the scene as a popular and legitimate medium. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the history of film, the first film productions basically start in France sometime towards the last 2 decades of the 19th century. Kind of depends how we want to define film. Are we talking about the actual sort of substance that's being used? Are we talking about the length? Are we talking about the style? Right? So there's a lot of different ways we can define film, and that changes when we would say it kind of first emerges. But all of these sort of early films they're very primitive. This is the kind of stuff that you would see maybe through a peephole, right? So you would go, there's something spinning, you look at the images, you see a little 2-minute long film. One of the most earliest films is just workers going into a factory. There's not really a plot. There aren't characters. And it's not something that really appeals to a broader audience, or at least it's not pitched towards a broader audience. This is the type of thing that you might see at the Moulin Rouge. This is the thing that you might see at a carnival, right? It's something, there's a kind of seediness to it. It's not accepted or seen as virtuous in popular culture yet. However, World War I begins to change this. Basically, one of the things that all of the governments start to realize is film is a really great way to tell a story. And so if I'm trying to convince my population that we're winning the war, if I try to help them understand that there was some heroic battle and our side won, or maybe we stopped the advance of the enemy, something like that, film is an enormously powerful way of doing that. And so they start showing films to audiences during World War I, and in doing so, they legitimize them. So when the war ends, there's this tremendous enthusiasm across the European continent for the new medium. The invention of electronic sound recording in the 1920s adds to this allure. By the early 1920s, the film industry had become so popular that trips to the cinema became a regular occurrence. By 1929, in a country like Germany, there are over 5,600 movie theaters, compared with just 2,400 in 1919. In the city of Berlin alone, in 1924, they sell more than 400 million cinema tickets. Right? So this is the beginning of a golden age of film. The 1920s, you could argue the 1950s as well, especially something like Hollywood. Right? These are golden eras of film when it really breaks out on the scene and becomes enormously popular. Now, as the film industry grows, studios invested in many of the types of films that you can still see today, right? What are the big films that are going to bring them into the box offices? It's dramas, it's comedies, it's adventures to some extent, maybe some romance. But these nascent film studios also begin to fund directors who are willing to break down traditional barriers. Again, modernism is all about this fascination with the psychological. What better way to get into someone's head than to do it through the medium of film? And so a great example of this kind of early modernist film would be Robert Wiene's 1920 Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which was one of the first horror films ever made. Now, the plot revolves around the visit of the mysterious Caligari, who operates a sideshow attraction with a somnambulist named Caesar. Basically, this is kind of like a hypnotist. Caesar will go out and hypnotize the audience, and it's very psychological, you're open at persuasion, that kind of thing. A series of murders then take place around the town, with Caesar emerging as the main suspect. Eventually, the film's protagonist, Francis, tracks the killer back to Dr. Caligari, who it turns out is actually the director of an insane asylum who has been using the patients to carry out the murders. Now, the movie nominally ends with Caligari's arrest and placement in his own asylum. However, there is a plot twist. In its concluding scene, we discover that Francis is not a hero, but rather he is actually an inmate in Caligari's asylum who has been fantasizing about the whole story. After he attacks the real Caligari, they put Francis in a straitjacket, and then the movie ends. Now, there's a lot about this film that reflects the modernist spirit of the 1920s. The movie itself is highly psychological. It's not focused on the usual entertainment question of, there's some problem, there's some test, will the hero overcome it? Instead, it concentrates on themes of fear and terror. It is irrationalist, as neither the protagonist nor the audience really see reality all that clearly. I love this. Think about it, right? How better to demonstrate to the audience the problem of modern perceptions, the inability of our five senses to rationally and completely conquer the world. You show them a movie and then you do a plot twist at the end and, everything you thought that was happening was not actually happening. Your own eyes have deceived you within the course of the film. The plot itself is full of people who are living double lives, pretending and seeming to be people that they are not. There are also, obviously, various layers of hypnotism, insanity, right? There's this whole obsession with mental state. This is very, very typical of the period. There's also the revolutionary element, right? If we're talking about an insane asylum, a director, straitjackets, then we're also talking about issues of authority and conformity. And this isn't really surprising that this gets worked in there, because the two writers of the film, Hans Janowitz and Karl Mayr, both of them were vehemently anti-war activists after the World War. Janowitz actually served as an officer during the conflict, but it turns him into a pacifist. Karl Mayr, to get out of fighting in the war, feigns insanity and in that way avoids being conscripted. But the most intriguing element of the movie, and you can find this on YouTube, by the way, you can watch it for free. The most incredible, most shocking element of the movie, I would argue, is actually its visual style, which broke with all previous convention. Instead of trying to kind of create or recreate realities, the sets more closely resembled those of a modern-style play, where detail is not fully fleshed out and much is left for the imagination of the viewer to construct. The sets also rely on lots of sharp edges and curved lines, seemingly more like distortions of a carnival funhouse than the rationalized landscape of everyday life. Again, one of the big points of the movie is to say to the viewer, you cannot see reality clearly. In the modern age, there is a kind of fundamental dissonance, and instead of pretending like we don't see it, let us explore it, let us perhaps celebrate it, let us acknowledge it. And this is what happens in the movie. Now, another great modernist film, perhaps not as stylistically shocking, but in terms of the material, in terms of the story, the plot, definitely fits up there with this kind of questions about life in the late 1920s, early 1930s in Europe, would be the film The Blue Angel, or Der Blaue Engel, which proves to be the breakthrough performance for a young woman named Marlene Dietrich. The film revolves around a bourgeois high school teacher named Emanuel Rott, whose moral concern for his students lead him to encounter the beautiful and seductive singer Lola at a seedy cabaret called The Blue Angel. So again, kind of almost like a Footloose plot, right? What are the young people doing? They're getting themselves into trouble. They're going to see this nightclub dancer. Emanuel Rott is going to, kind of put his foot down, restore order, bourgeois sensibilities. Let's get back to focusing on what matters. Despite Rott's best efforts, however, his sexual desire overcomes his mind, and he soon seduces and begins to have an affair with this singer. As time passes, he moves increasingly away from the rational bourgeois world that he previously inhabited. He quits his job as a high school teacher and eventually joins the circus in order to be with her. He literally becomes a clown in the service of love, but it's not really love. It's more lust, right? It's more obsession. The singer likes him, but is also open to having other relationships. Lola has other love interests, which of course inspire anger and jealousy in Rott. Now, again, think about something like jealousy. Jealousy is not, for the most part, a rational emotion. We would say we don't feel jealousy, we should be content with the things that we have, or we are overcome with jealousy despite our best efforts to control it. Think back to kindergarten. You were a toddler, you played with toys. Didn't matter if you had almost all the toys, you had your favorite toys. You saw some other toddler playing with a toy, and you instinctively became jealous. And you acted in a way that didn't necessarily make sense. And the teacher tells you, don't be jealous. That's his toy. Leave it alone. Didn't matter because jealousy comes from a darker place within. And that darker place within is really, really fascinating to 1920s Europeans. To get back to our story, in the end, Rott dies of a broken heart, realizing all that he's thrown away. Now, although obviously The Blue Angel is a slightly different film than Dr. Caligari, it once again reflects this fascination with the psychological and the sexual, and the notion of crossing social and cultural boundaries, although this one tends to be a little bit more pessimistic about what happens if we do that. Okay, so far we've talked about visual media such as paintings, we've talked about film, we've talked about architecture, we've talked about writing and language. But there's one last area that we need to discuss, which is obviously sound. We'll talk more about some of the broader shifts that occurred in the sounds of European cities in our next episode when we talk about the city. We'll talk about recording, radio, gramophones, technology, that sort of thing. But I want to conclude with a short discussion of jazz. Now, jazz is notoriously hard to define, but it more or less emerges out of African American culture in the Deep South in places like New Orleans towards the end of the 19th century. Without getting lost in musical jargon, there are two key elements of jazz that make it the kind of symbolic music, if you will, of the 1920s, that reflect some of these trends that we've been talking about today. First, jazz tends to be highly emotional. It has a kind of swingy beat that makes you want to move around to it, that makes you kind of animate you, that is emotional. I think for a second about some of the major instruments used in a jazz band. There are a whole bunch of wind instruments like trumpets, saxophone, trombone. So not just wind instruments like a flute where we play the flute, okay, we're blowing music through, it's making noises. But if you think about using a saxophone, every time I play the saxophone, because it is partially dependent on the amount of force that I'm blowing with, right? The amount of air that I'm putting into it, the sequencing of pressing various buttons, because there is so much of it that is dependent on not rhythms, but on just kind of the pure functionality of it, the pure motion of it, it becomes more emotional. One could argue that each jazz performance is a bit of an improvisation because it's so hard to replicate, right, the exact amount of force coming out of my lungs time and time and time again. And so if you think about, again, the saxophone, it's an instrument that we really have to put our spirit into. It's an instrument that we can kind of get lost in the melody, in the rhythm, and it just kind of takes us away. The second reason, which I kind of already mentioned before, is, again, jazz for this reason is incredibly improvisational. Each performer might do something a bit different each time. Jazz bands, the playing of jazz, becomes more of a jam session than it is a scripted performance. If you are playing jazz, it is totally appropriate to take the music in a totally different direction if that's how you feel. When you listen to jazz bands and they start kind of doing a jam, kind of typical thing that they'll do is you'll have instruments that sort of start talking to each other. So the person on the horn will play a certain set of notes, and the person on the saxophone will then follow with a kind of almost echo of them. And then they go back and forth, or maybe they'll change a little bit, right? They echo, they go back and forth. And this all becomes part again of this modernist movement, right? We're breaking conventional boundaries. We're doing things differently. We're getting into emotion and psychology and breaking away from structure. Now, there's a third element of jazz that make it extremely revolutionary, and that is the racial element to it. Jazz, as I said, comes from African Americans, especially in places like New Orleans in the late 19th century. It is understood in Europe as a black form of music. Prior to World War I, these kind of racial interactions they're not quite as regulated as they are in the United States, although it kind of depends on what country you're in. But it's also, one would say, it's not very celebrated either. World War I, again, proves to be a catalyst for change. One of the things that happens is many African Americans come over and serve in the U.S. Army. We tend to think about this more in terms of World War II and the desegregation that follows. But World War I, there are African American troops that come to France. Units like the 369th Infantry, the Harlem Hellfighters. And they not only come over with their guns, they not only come over with the fighting spirit to help win World War I, but they bring instruments with them. They play jazz. And Europeans eat it up. They love, especially in the urban communities, this fresh, new sound that people can kind of emote to. People can dance to it. We're going to talk more about this in our third episode on modernism when we talk about revolutions in sex and sexuality. But dancing in the early 1920s becomes radically different. You can do things like the two-step or the Charleston. You can move parts of your body, as we'll talk about, that you never actually got to move before. And so in the 1920s, jazz sweeps through European cities, especially Paris, especially Berlin, especially London. And you start getting a massive American influence. Artists like Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Cab Calloway, Glenn Miller, all of this stuff comes in and starts to revolutionize European notions of gender and especially sexuality. We're going to talk about this again more later. But jazz is such a key part of this modernist revolutionary moment. And ultimately, this focus on pleasure is where the true spirit of the age winds up going. We talk about this era as being the Roaring Twenties. Why is it the Roaring Twenties, right? If I say the Roaring Twenties, what do you think of? You think of flappers, you think of people in tuxedos, you think of the Great Gatsby, parties, dancing. You might think of cocaine, which becomes very popular in this period. The Roaring Twenties are a good time. The Roaring Twenties are fun. And the Roaring Twenties are also about pleasure. So again, we'll talk about this more in future episodes, but these revolutions in art that we talked about today also carry over into the politics of sex and gender as well, as a new generation of Europeans emancipated themselves from the traditional roles assigned them by the pre-war generation. For many young women, left without the prospect of a husband by the devastating effects of the war, the idea of a life independent of marriage and motherhood suddenly not only seems kind of like desirable, but it seems possible. It seems reasonable. What else are you supposed to do if 50% of the men that are your age are dead? Right? If there's 2 or 3 girls, 4 girls maybe, for every eligible bachelor. Well, then maybe I don't have to get married. Maybe I can't get married. What am I going to do? The Roaring Twenties says, don't worry, we're going to reinvent the notion of what women are supposed to live for. In the post-war era, some women would by necessity have to rely on themselves, a prospect that some greeted as liberating. Now, of course, again, what is liberating to one person terrifies someone else. If we start talking about something like the idea of sex outside of wedlock, this becomes increasingly popular, spurred on by the fact that there had been quite a lot of sex outside of marriage during the war. Of course, it's not surprising. Why are people having sex outside of marriage? Well, because they're not seeing each other much, because they might die tomorrow, because there's not enough men to get married, so you can't just rely on marriage for that. So those borders and institutions, the things that are breaking down here are not just political authorities, political institutions. We're talking about cultural institutions as well, cultural expectations. The expansion of the franchise that occurred in many countries after World War I that will give women the right to vote also increases their political power. It forces political parties to anticipate and think about the needs of women. If I can quote a kind of bad Mel Gibson movie from the 1990s, what do women want? This isn't just a joke. This isn't just the eternal question that men ask all the time. This is a question political parties in the 1920s suddenly need to answer because all these women can vote. So all of these things kind of go together in this kind of gendered revolution that take place in the early 1920s. Now, when we talk about gender, we usually talk about women, but we should note that the newfound sexual liberation also extends to men as well. Now, there was a little bit more liberty for men, sexually speaking, before, primarily heterosexual men. But in the 1920s and into the 1930s, we start to have the emergence, the growing public awareness of gay communities, especially in urban centers such as places like Berlin and Paris. Here, male homosexuality became more public, flourishing in a kind of golden age before the complications of fascism and then, of course, the war. Now, again, I just used the word liberating several times, and in today's climate, that is probably how most of the events that I've discussed today are viewed. Probably very few of you are sitting around going, I can't believe we use glass and steel. That's when, society all started falling apart. Point taken. But as social conventions and norms are shed, as I've said, it's perfectly reasonable to ask, what is the cost of breaking this boundary? What happens if we start accepting the idea that people can have sex outside of marriage? What happens to the family, which is the sociological unit that makes having and raising children possible, or at least that's what people believed in the 1920s? Many people today would argue that the family is the best way to raise a child. Yes, you could have one parent. Yes, we could have some sort of commune raising kids, I guess. What's the answer? Who knows, right? It's up for debate. People are entitled to their own opinions. Another big question, of course, and one that perhaps we're kind of still wrestling with today, what happens if we start to accept the idea of male homosexuality? If we accept the idea that men do not need to necessarily copulate with women, what happens to the birth rate? Perhaps even more importantly, what happens if we start changing codes of masculinity? If we think about what a man is supposed to be, there are various expectations of it. In the 1920s, for sure, a big part of that was man is supposed to be virile, man is supposed to want woman, man is supposed to get married, have family, become dad, become public authority. In the 1920s and even into the 1950s, all of those things are linked together. You can't just select 4 out of 5 and say, well, I'm just going to leave this one out. So what happens the first time that you start to say, okay, we're just going to stop doing things, or we're going to take various elements of masculinity out? What happens if we start allowing the concept of effeminate men? In the 1920s, in a world where people believe in social Darwinism, this isn't just a trivial question. It's not just a personal question. It's a question that many assume is linked to the destiny of their societies. So again, these developments in art, film, architecture, these aren't just perceived in a vacuum. It's not just something going on within this sphere of art, within your sort of circle. They often provoke fear and anxiety, and they raise the specter of cultural degeneration. And it is this social anxiety that provides the fertile ground for the fascist reactionary movements in the 1930s. Not only can you not understand fascism if you don't understand World War I, you also need to understand it's not just, oh, there's things going on in the Soviet Union. Well, okay, so there's stuff going on over there. Who cares? It's also that the revolutions are happening at the most basic levels of culture in European societies, individually speaking. And that makes a lot of people really concerned. Okay. In the end, we can conclude that these two emotions, joy at liberation, fear at transgression of boundaries, again, these are two sides of the same modernist coin, the spirit, if you will, of the 1920s. And we'll explore them further in our next two episodes on life in the metropolis and changes to sex and gender norms. That's going to be it for now. Thanks again for listening. As always, if you'd like to find out more about the period, you can look on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. There you can find recommendations for reading. You can find some sources. I'll try to post some pictures that I mentioned in the lecture today. If you are so inclined, we would also appreciate any financial support that you might be able to give us. We have a Patreon page for those of you that would like to support us monthly. It can be as little as $1 a month. We also have links to direct donation pages as well through things like PayPal. So again, you can go on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com, for more on those resources. That's it for now. We hope you'll join us next time as we take history off